When people hear that Donald Trump wants Greenland, the immediate reaction is usually disbelief or laughter. But here's the thing, the real obstacle isn't Denmark. It isn't NATO. And it isn't even Europe. The real obstacle is Greenland itself. And once you understand why, you start to see why this story is far more dangerous and far more unresolved than it looks. Greenland holds the legal power. Greenland isn't just a remote Arctic territory. It has real political agency. Under Greenland's Self-Government Act, just 16 out of 31 lawmakers can trigger a formal process to renegotiate Greenland's relationship with Denmark that would immediately launch talks on independence. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Both the start and the end of those negotiations require a referendum of the Greenlandic population. And even if Greenland votes yes, Denmark's parliament would still need to ratify the final outcome. In practice, Denmark would almost certainly respect Greenland's choice. But legally and politically, nothing moves without Greenland's consent, which means any US plan runs straight into Greenlandic public opinion. Trump versus political reality. This is where Trump's ambitions hit a wall. Trump doesn't have broad political backing at home for taking Greenland, and he's facing unusually unified resistance in Europe. That matters, because it effectively removes the most extreme option from the table. A military move would fracture the Republican Party, trigger a transatlantic crisis, and likely fail outright. So instead, Trump has shifted tactics. Rather than military pressure, the US is now relying on economic coercion, specifically tariff threats, to force negotiations. That shift tells you something crucial. Hard power isn't working. Soft power isn't working, so Trump is trying leverage. What the US actually wants, despite the noise, the US still hasn't clearly defined its demands. But logically, everything boils down to three core objectives. First, Trump wants control, not just access, not just basing rights. Control. Second, the US wants to eliminate environmental and permitting barriers that slow military construction. Third, Washington wants full freedom to deploy offensive weapons systems, something Denmark and NATO have historically resisted to avoid turning Greenland into a target. The most obvious compromise would be a long-term lease of part of Greenland, but European officials are deeply skeptical Trump would accept that, unless it effectively gives the US near total operational authority. For a lease to work, it would need to be extremely long-term, cover a large contiguous area, not just individual bases, grant the US full control over sitting and permitting inside the zone. At that point, you're not far from de facto sovereignty. Why Greenland is saying no. Even if Washington and Copenhagen found a formula, selling this deal in Greenland would be extraordinarily difficult. Legally, Greenland must approve any agreement. Politically, sentiment has moved sharply against the US. All four parties in Greenland's governing coalition oppose American control, and in response to the crisis, the government has even paused its own independence push, a remarkable step to avoid destabilizing the situation. Officials describe Greenlandic society as deeply values-based, especially around 1. Land ownership, 2. Environmental protection, 3. Cultural autonomy. Those values clash directly with expanded US military control that makes this crisis fundamentally different from a normal basing negotiation. The tariff threat problem, so Trump turns to tariffs. The threat of a 10% tariff on European countries is meant to raise the cost of resistance, especially for Denmark. But history suggests these threats may not last. Based on past tariff brinkmanship, Trump often backs down before implementation, or reverses course shortly after, and his legal authority may soon be constrained by the Supreme Court. Add weak polling and rising consumer sensitivity to inflation, and Trump's room to maneuver narrows further, which raises an uncomfortable question for Washington. If tariffs fail, what leverage is left? Europe's red lines. Europe is holding back, deliberately. If the US imposes tariffs, The EU is ready to retaliate with targeted measures covering up to €93 billion in US exports, including aircraft, autos, and alcohol. But Europe's most powerful tool, the Anti-Coercion Instrument, which could restrict US service companies' access to the single market, remains unused for now. That's intentional. Brussels wants de-escalation, but it's also signaling that if pressure continues, escalation won't be one-sided. The core reality, the core problem is this: Trump wants control. Greenland wants autonomy. Europe wants stability. Those goals don't align, and unless one of them changes, Greenland remains unattainable, not because of military force, but because of law, legitimacy, and political reality. That's what makes this story dangerous, not because a deal is easy, but because it isn't.